I don't think he's asking us to believe entirely. He's not asking us to be converted to his point of view. He's asking us to think. And if we can be happy, if we can make that step, because I agree with him, American society is so placid. Um, we so accepting, so non-critical of our our own actions and the impact on the future, that if we can shake society up a little bit and get people to think and stop and reflect and change their ways, but that's a monumental task.
Important is intelligent discussion of democracy. As Chomsky and others, I'm sure, would agree, in America today, the ability of an average citizen to have input into the political system is extremely limited. Very limited to just, every 2 or 4 years going to the polls and voting for somebody. Most of the time, oftentimes, the people that were elected into office don't really represent the views of any individual voter. There's a lot of things that individual voters may disagree with. 99.999% of all decisions that affect Americans are done by legislative bodies, groups, governors, mayors, presidents of the U.S. Congress, etc., by these elites in the system. The average citizen doesn't have a whole lot of say. So how important is intelligent discussion in the whole political system? One could argue quite forcefully that it isn't all that important for ordinary Americans because they don't have much political say in what happens in this country.
Even when you are concerned, and even if you are aware, the monumental weight of society is so enormous. It's so difficult to impact a positive change. Last night I held a banquet for my freshman class, the 101, 101, no, 110, there it is, 110, sampling of the various cuisines of the world. And this is for world civilizations, to give us some exposure to the various differences in the world, not just what people eat, but the makeup of what people eat and how many calories people consume per country, and how does this actually expand into income levels and standards of living.
I apologize.
And yet, everyone's bringing paper plates and plastic forks, and the amount of garbage that those events created was monstrous.
Do you think that people are aware of how much garbage we just create in the lifestyle we live?
No, I don't. So that will be something for me to pick up on Friday, is to mention to my class, okay, we did this, those are the benefits, now what about the consequences of these actions? This is the negatives. And I can't control their behavior. All I can do, which is I think what Norm Chomsky is trying to do, is make them aware of their behavior. And if we can make people aware, then perhaps on an individual level, if they'll take responsibility for it, we can begin to see the change.
There is some critical thought being produced in universities today, in graduate programs, in the social sciences in particular, that is happening. But in undergrad area programs, and especially in all business schools and other things, you don't see the same kind of critical thinking that's going on. In my own classes, I try to instill the idea that it's important that we all take responsibility for protecting basic things like civil rights, freedom of speech, and all of that. And how do you get that across to students without sounding like you're preaching to the congregation or something? Not an easy thing to do.
From his lectern in the chancel, the rector reads a scripture lesson from the Psalms. It should be remembered that the Episcopal service is short.
The argument that people today have been taught essentially to be consumers, it's important to be consumers, and that they focus heavily on materialism and material things in life, is very prominent in the social sciences. Chomsky's not alone there. In fact, that's ground that's already well covered by Karl Marx, 150 years ago. But it is a concern that Chomsky raises. It's one that doesn't seem to play well into the media landscape because you don't hear a whole lot of it in mass media. because the whole system is set up to cater to the interests of consumers. We're told over and over again that, you know, 2/3 of the economy is driven by consumers. So who is going to speak up and say, no, stop being a consumer? To say that is almost sacrilegious, and to call into question the basic fundamentals of the system, and you would be called a heretic and all of that.
Reebok Easy Tone shoes not only look fantastic, they'll help make your legs and butt look great too. It's the shoe-proven dude.
How do we produce more people who would say that fame, or rather that the glory in life, comes from your job rather than from the money that you earn? How do we get more people to think that way? I don't know. I mean, you just keep trying to tell them stories about things that have happened in which people who have focused on, not on money, but on other things, have succeeded and have been able to make the world a better place. Hopefully that'll help convince some of them. The comment, well, that's a very, very good question. That's actually the essence of my book on the Ivory Tower of Babel. It's about the individual against the institution or the system as a whole. And I don't have all of the answers for that. I can tell you this, that individuals by themselves have a very difficult time influencing the system. Power comes through organization, resources, and other things, and the more people you have, the more powerful you can get. But the only problem there is that what we find is the more these organizations grow, the bigger they get, the more mainstream they become. They tend to lose their radical edge. So you've got this two-edged sword going through the system on that. But I think for me, it has to start at least with a recognition among those in power that what you need to do is to empower ordinary people, give them a greater say in things that affect their lives, allow them, for example, to vote directly on some issues that come up either at a national, state, or local level. In other words, referenda, basically. Like in Oregon is kind of a leader in this area, and so is Washington State to some extent. The more referenda that we can get to allow ordinary people to make decisions, I think the better off we'll be.
There is something in there, in our minds, in our brains, and we come born with it. And it isn't, it's a way of thinking, it's a process of thinking itself. And I'm no expert on Noam Chomsky's linguistic theory, so I'm on shaky ground here. But I like the idea, because that, as teaching world history, to begin with the idea that there is somehow an innate level of, I'd say, consciousness, if not conscience, and that would be really pushing things. But we come to the world with certain things already set in our minds. And with that in place, if we can, how we evaluate the world, the decisions we make in the world, the way we interact with other people, if there is something to that, a basic core of humanity. And I think he would say that it is a core of humanity, and by that I mean not just human behavior, but here we're getting into moralistic terms, a sense of decency, a sense of world order.
Fear has been fomented in recent years. It has been cultivated, this culture of fear that Chomsky wrote about. And there was very little room in that culture of fear for any sense of compassion. And if you talk about the war on terror, you ultimately need to look at the root causes. And while no one justifies what happened, any conversation about what drove people to do these was squelched. And instead, this culture of fear was built. Whereas Chomsky's saying, if you look at what drives people, if you reach out in a compassionate way to people, then perhaps they look at you differently and they treat you differently. And it's ultimately a very Buddhist concept, that there's a Buddhist prayer that says, may all beings live in happiness and have the causes of happiness. And if you mold a foreign policy around maybe not quite that language, but that concept, that idea of being compassionate to the world rather than confronting the world, you end up living in a very different world.